Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you all here, and thank you for those of you who are joining us online. I'm Lili. I'm a reporter covering NATO at POLITICO in Brussels. And I'm very pleased to be here with you this afternoon for a panel on NATO, Bigger, Better, Stronger. And I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel. We have Martin Sklenár, Slovakia's defense minister, and Tom Goffus, NATO's Assistant Secretary General for Operations.
Hi.
Thank you all for joining us again. I think it's a very timely occasion to be discussing NATO and the future of NATO, because in just a few weeks, many of us in this room will be in Vilnius, and leaders from across the alliance will be discussing the future of the alliance. They will be discussing defense investment, they will be discussing the relationship with Ukraine, and they will be welcoming at least one new member to the table. So to start off, I'd like to ask Mr. Goffus. We have seen a new member join the alliance just a few weeks ago, Finland, in what I must say was a very emotional ceremony for some officials I observed on the lawn outside of NATO HQ. But Finland joining has a lot more than symbolic value. It also brings operational challenges, but also new capabilities to the alliance. What do you see as the biggest challenges and also the most important new capabilities that Finland brings to the table?
Well, thanks, Lili, and it's great to be here in Globsec in Bratislava. I got to, this morning, just as a starter, I got to participate in the Young Leaders Forum, which I highly recommend to anybody that needs an energy boost. It was fantastic. The questions were absolutely spot on. They were sophisticated. And you're going to hear me talk about today that we're at a generational inflection point. And that's the generation that's going to implement what we're going to get done this year and in the next year. And I couldn't be happier than to see these bright young leaders, which is exactly what they're going to be. So to the question on Finland, it's really Finland and Sweden is how we think about it in terms of getting them in. Obviously, we're hoping that will happen by Vilnius. But both of them bring significant capabilities to the alliance. They have professional military forces that have very holistic, whole-of-society defense plans, and also that those capabilities are regularly exercised. And for example, in Sweden, at the beginning of May, they just finished their total defense exercise. 26,000 women and men in all three domains of air, land, and maritime. Absolutely shows you what they're capable of, what they're going towards, and one of the reasons why they wanted to join NATO. They see the issues. This is the first big exercise of this kind. It's the biggest exercise they've done in 25 years. So they've shown that they're capable of that. When Finland and Sweden join the alliance, it'll be 150 additional fourth-generation fighters. And by the end of this decade, Finland will be adding 65 fifth-generation F-35s. The Finns have a huge army reserve that's well-trained, and the Swedes have some exquisite underwater capabilities, including submarines. These are allies with fantastic capabilities. They also have a lot of resilience, and I call it societal resilience. Whether it's electricity grids or whether for Finland, for example, has stockpiles of food and fuel reserves that can last months. In fact, I would say our newest member of the alliance, Finland, is the poster child of resilience. So those are some of the fantastic capabilities that come with them joining. As always, integration is an issue. And we've been leaning forward and figuring out how to integrate them into NATO's plans. And the new plans that NATO is coming up with will, in fact, integrate national plans with NATO plans. That's one of the big pieces of that. It is a challenge, but I will say on day one when Finland joined the alliance, we wanted to make sure that they had the proper Article 5 coverage. And so people came up to me, they were really worried. They were like, oh my goodness, they have almost 1,300 kilometers of border with Russia. How are we going to protect them with integrated air and missile defense? And I said, I think you can relax. The Finns have fourth generation fighters. The Finns also operate NASAM systems. They have advanced systems. They have defense plans, and they exercise them. For example, the Finns have never stopped doing this, practicing this, which is landing fighter aircraft on highways, refueling them, and putting new munitions on board, which gives them extended basing options, increasing their resilience. And so my point was, the day that Finland joined the alliance, the Finnish border became one of the strong points of integrated air and missile defense on the eastern flank. And frankly, from an integration perspective, our Finnish friends and Swedish friends, my team reached out to go, what are your questions? We can't actually integrate them until they formally join, but the questions that they ask are the exact right ones. In fact, my staff came back to me and said, wow, I wish all the allies asked these questions that are that good. So the other piece of this, I would say, is that this isn't new. Seeing Finnish and Swedish soldiers working with NATO is not new. Finland and Sweden became PFP, Partnership for Peace, partners in 1994. In 2014, they became enhanced opportunity partners, so they could exercise more, do more with NATO. And they participated in Afghanistan, in the Balkans, in Iraq. So we've seen them before, we know them, they know us. Now they're becoming a formal part. So yes, it is a challenge to integrate them, but it is also to the benefit of the alliance. One of the biggest pieces is the geopolitical reach that we have. With their air bases and naval bases, it makes it much easier for NATO to reinforce, to support, to supply the Baltics and Poland. The other thing it does for NATO, quite frankly, if Russia were reckless enough to try and attack the alliance anywhere between, on the eastern flank between Turkey and Estonia, they now have 1,300 kilometers of exposed borders on their northern flank. So that is a plus. That's something that NATO can present strategic dilemmas to Russia. So I think it's actually increased Russia's problems much more than NATO's problems. And to NATO, the challenges, what challenges there are definitely worth it, and they're definitely something that we can overcome and integrate it. So I think that when Putin invaded Ukraine because he wanted less NATO on his border, not more NATO, because of the reckless way he did it, in violation of all international law, he's getting more NATO, not less NATO. So thanks, Lili.
Minister Sklenár, from your perspective here in Slovakia, what does integrating Finland and potentially soon also Sweden mean for the eastern flank?
For the eastern flank, obviously it means more NATO, stronger NATO, better protection, more security and stability here. And very, very openly, it validates the point that being in NATO makes sense for our countries. You know, these are countries traditionally very much neutral, and they had several and different reasons for that. But this is how much the world has changed. This, and then the logical outcome and assessment is what do we do in these more difficult circumstances, more demanding circumstances that there are in the world? Let's join NATO, because that provides, that is the safe space, that is the safe port where to be the club of countries who are able and willing to work together to counter anything in the world.
And just for our audience, we also have a poll online on the Vilnius summit in case you'd like to participate. What will be the biggest issue at the summit? So you can vote what you think will be the most salient or will take up the most time for leaders. So defense spending, Ukraine's membership bid, military plans, defense industry issues, or even selecting a new Secretary General, potentially, who knows. But going back to our panel, one thing that is taking up a lot of time for NATO officials and for planners at the moment is finalizing the new force model and regional plans ahead of the Vilnius summit. So maybe we'll go to you, Mr. Goffus. What do you think the new force model and these regional plans would mean for NATO militaries and for governments as they do their own planning in terms of capabilities? So what will they have to change?
Great question, Lili. And the regional plans and the new force model, along with C2, are some of the biggest changes for NATO in addition to the posture that the minister talked about on the eastern flank. These are all what I would call generational changes, because for the last 25 years, what we spent time on was out-of-area operations, primarily counterterrorism. And the capabilities you need for that are different than from fighting collective territorial defense against a near-peer threat such as Russia. And these plans are going to drive the force model. So it's a threat-based plan. That's an operational plan that is driving defense planning, which is about capabilities and force structure and force model. And so you start with that regional plan first, you move to the new force model, and when we look at what we were doing, say for example in Afghanistan, and what we're going to need to do now, we know there are a couple key variables. One, in Afghanistan we were looking for light expeditionary forces, and Europe was trending in that direction. What we've seen on the battlefield of Ukraine is how important that scale and mass are. So we're back to heavier equipment at a higher readiness. Because when we're doing an out-of-area operation, NATO has time to sit and decide, do we want to go? How big do we want to go? How long do we want to go for? What are the objectives? If Russia attacks the alliance, Russia initially, until NATO earns it back, owns the timeline. And we have to be ready right then. So we're going to need more heavy equipment, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery, things like that, and more readiness, forces at a higher readiness state. And the plans are going to lay that out for the nations. When the nations agree to the plans, those plans then drive the next cycle of defense planning to determine what the new capabilities need to be. And I guarantee you it's going to be more, not less. So one last point would be on force presentation. This is part of the new force model. It's also part of the force structure. Lots of different terms to use it, but here's what happened in Afghanistan. If you were sending a brigade to Afghanistan, usually what you did is you had 3 brigades. It was rotational. One brigade was getting ready to go, one brigade was on the front line, and one brigade was recovering from going. And so what you did is you stole from Peter to pay Paul. To get one full up round out the door, you would steal supplies and spare parts from the other 2 brigades to get that one brigade and make sure that the folks going into combat had the best stuff. Now what we need to do, this is going to be one of the changes, is we need all 3 brigades to be ready to fight tonight. That's a change. And that's going to be a demand signal on the governments when they sign up for these plans.
Minister, when you look at the regional plans and the new force model, do you think that it is sufficient to address the concerns and the fears of countries on the eastern flank?
Well, and I agree with that. The plans are there to support NATO as a whole. Obviously, they focus on the eastern flank because this is a threat-based planning. That's where we focus our attention. On the 3 brigades, I fully agree. What I think is the advantage now in such a system or this situation that we are in is that we not only know that what each brigade how does it have to look like, but we also know what the task is going to be. So we can very precisely then plan what the task of the brigade is, how it should be prepared, what are the spare parts, what is the training, how do we get there, what do we need to bring with us. So there's quite a lot of advantages to have this modern approach, and we fully agree. I mean, it needs to be It needs to be in place for the countries to see, to work towards that end, to have the material, the source, the resources to fit that bill, and to be able to practice that as much as possible, and to show to the world that we are able to do this as often times and as quickly as needed.
Just to follow up, because you mentioned resources, one of the items on the agenda for Vilnius will be the future of the 2% defense investment pledge. And right now, at least the way what we're hearing in Brussels is that the consensus seems to be leaning toward 2% as a floor. But do you think that that would be sufficient, Minister?
Coming from the national experience, the 2% is not enough. This is something that we feel. We have done a lot of peace dividend, payouts in defense, and that has accumulated to a huge debt that there is in our national armed forces. I can imagine that many countries are in a very similar position. But so the 2% to get there, even in 5 years is not enough. But with the umbrella of NATO, we have the luxury, let's call it, of stretching that out. So the 2%, if they are seen as a minimum, the more we can do, the better. The sooner that we can cross the 2% margin with everybody, with all the countries on board, the better for NATO as such. We will do our utmost. Our plan is to spend at least 2% this year, and next year, and the year 2025. And we will, as we draft our budgets for the next year, we will try to work with the finance ministry to push that as much as possible.
Yes, of course, the perspective in the capitals and in the domestic budget process is often a bit different from the way it is seen in HQ. So, Mr. Goffus, I was wondering how you see it from Brussels. Where should allies go when it comes to defense investment, not only in the coming year or two, but maybe even in the next decade?
Yeah, it's a great question, and frankly, this string that runs from threat-based plans to force requirements to capabilities also goes directly towards investment. That's where it ends up. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's where the real political decisions will be made. And I think the minister put it exactly right. Definitely 2% is the bare minimum, and many nations are going to have to go above that. And that will be also, I think, part of the message. 2% is the bare minimum, and nations will likely need to go beyond that. And when you take these capabilities and actually price them out, some of this stuff is expensive. A mechanized brigade is not cheap. Integrated air and missile defense, which is another big item that we need to look at, because in Afghanistan, the Taliban didn't have aircraft, and they didn't have cruise missiles. And so we took air superiority for granted over the last 2.5 decades. While we were doing that, the Russians, Putin was focusing on building a missile arsenal, an advanced missile arsenal, and building his own integrated air and missile defense. So we gave Russia about a 30-year head start, and we need to catch up. That's going to cost money, and I think nations will quickly realize that there's a need for more than just 2%. And the war in Ukraine on NATO's doorstep makes it very clear, if not now, when?
And to follow up on that, Minister, one thing that we often hear in national capitals is that it's difficult for politicians to do long-term planning because they're planning sometimes for the next election. But one thing that leaders will be discussing in Vilnius is the sustainability of aid to Ukraine, because we're seeing that the conflict is not a short-lived one. And with no end in sight, industry, governments are all asking, how long will this go on and how do we prepare? So as a policymaker, how do you think about the sustainability of the investment and the assistance that you're giving to Ukraine?
Yes. First, on the air defense piece, very important. Of course, I agree. Not that we are starting from zero. I mean, we have done something. NATO can protect the airspace. But on the longer term, well, I understand that people look at it from a perspective of the conflict going on in Ukraine, but necessarily we have to regard this as something that we have to take into account for our own defense and our own security. So whatever we see that is happening in Ukraine and the lessons and the experience that comes with equipment coming from the West. We have to take into account and put that in our plans. It's not just the equipment, how it should be, developed to to meet the expectations of modern day conflict of the conventional size that we see, but also we see that industry is a very significant part of that equation, not only for the sake of deterrence, but basically to be able to deliver on all the capabilities and the plans and what we need to put at the disposal of the countries and NATO as such. So if we don't think only about the situation in Ukraine, but from a more broader perspective, how do we want to go about our defense capability build up and what is necessary for the changed situation, that puts us in a different point of view, and from there planning, obviously, I mean, it has to be long term. It requires predictability of resources, not only finance, but also you need more people, you need obviously more equipment, you need more training, you need bigger training areas. There's a lot that the countries have to think about. How defense is again very important, and after the 30 plus years of reductions, now is the time to go back and see what have we not sold or given away, and reconstitute that for the sake of defense.
Very interesting. Of course, we talked about Finland and Sweden, but there are other countries that are hoping to join NATO one day, specifically Ukraine. Ukraine's bid is something that I know in the hallways here at the conference has been discussed. Ukrainian officials have been pushing for at least a political signal in Vilnius from the allies on eventually joining the alliance. One agenda item for Vilnius will be the expended cap, so a program to help the Ukrainian military. So I was wondering, maybe Mr. Goffus, if you'd like to expand a bit about what that program, that multi-year program could look like.
Yeah, sure. Lili, it's a really good point. It's the practical cooperation with Ukraine to show partly our solidarity and also to move them closer to Ukraine over the long term. In the short term, we continue to provide things like fuel, secure communications, counter-drone equipment, the things that they need that are non-lethal on the battlefield today. And then over the longer term, what we're looking to do is help make sure that future Russian aggression doesn't happen against Ukraine. One of the ways to do that, and probably one of the key ways to do that, is through long-term defense planning for the future armed forces of Ukraine to help them become modern, NATO interoperable, and sustainable. That is a prerequisite for an enduring peace so that Russia doesn't just keep chipping away at European security. We think this is vitally important. We've been working with them for months on this. While they're at war, we're also working on the future plans. We're looking at planning for post-conflict reconstruction of military infrastructure. To the minister's point, we're looking at a way of harnessing the lessons learned from Ukraine. One is, this is one way that Ukraine gives back to NATO. Ukrainians have the most experience of anybody in the world in fighting Russian kinetic aggression and disinformation. And they have societal resilience. That's one of the key pieces that's helping them survive. So we're trying to harness that and make that, those lessons learned, capture that, and make sure that we're putting those into NATO's future adaptation. Those are just a few of the programs. We're also working on medical rehabilitation. At the end of this conflict, we'll have to reintegrate about 500,000 soldier citizens back into society. And we're working on a plan for helping them with that as well, and how we're going to do that.
Maybe now we can go see the results of our poll. I must say I'm not very surprised, but the majority of the audience, or not almost the majority, 46%, believe that Ukraine's membership bid will be the biggest issue at the Vilnius summit. So, Minister, this is a very politically sensitive issue because we have some Western capitals that have tried to somewhat avoid the matter. I think that they're arguing that it's best to seriously discuss membership after the conflict ends. We have some countries on the eastern flank that think differently. From Slovakia's perspective, what would you be advocating for? How should NATO approach Ukraine's membership bid?
It should. I'll come back to that. I'm surprised that defense spending is the very, very least favorite.
Oh yes, only 8% said
of the
defense spending.
Vilnius summit. Well, I wish it was that simple. On Ukraine, obviously, first and foremost, this is very much Ukraine's decision. I mean, they are the ones who made the decision. They want to apply for NATO membership, and this is how they feel that they want to go about their security and defense. And we're here to make it happen. I mean, for Slovakia, this is our story. This is exactly what we have done. This is what we have also put forward to our current allies as a partner, asking them to consider our bid, and that's what we are doing also with Ukraine. For us as a country, this has obviously more significance because we have a direct border with Ukraine. There's our direct interest is in having NATO territory extending beyond the border as much as possible. I mean, this is obvious, and there are probably Czechs in the audience, and you can ask them how they feel about Slovakia being part of NATO. This is the same calculation or the perception. So for us, this makes a lot of sense. Obviously, there is the situation that Ukraine is fighting an aggression on their soil, and that needs to be taken into account when we discuss how and when Ukraine becomes a NATO member.
I have to follow up because you said you wish that defense spending would be, so simple. Do you think that it will dominate the Vilnius discussion?
It will not dominate, but it's always there. I mean, the 2%, 2.5, 3%. Some spend even more. That's always a very, very likable discussion to have, to be represented by one number. But the defense spending is basically everywhere. If you talk about plans, you need to take into account the finance, right? And that it's not only about force development, but for us it's also about infrastructure. I mean, if we should get ready to receive forces from allied countries, there needs to be the infrastructure to take them in. And we see this with our multinational battle group, which has been in place for 1 year. This has been quite a, challenging year in terms of infrastructure development, and more is to be done. So whatever we talk about, there's finance involved inevitably in such a discussion. So it's going to be there. Most of it is going to be about the modernization, but there's other strands of the effort that we need to make sure that we have the money.
We have a lot of questions from the audience. Do we have any questions in the room? I'll take one online first, while you think here in the room. There is a question about technological change. How do you see the technological exponential change and NATO's multi-domain warfare, future warfare reflected in strategies? Sorry, I think the question disappeared, but you got the gist of it.
It's okay.
Yes. How is it reflected in current plans on mass and scale? Maybe Mr. Goffus, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, good question. We have an entire division that works on what we call, emerging disruptive technologies, AI, and big data, quantum computing, those kinds of things. And we are working to ensure that those capabilities are brought into the forces that NATO has. They're not standalone pieces, though. They're more or less enhancers of the capabilities that we already know we need to have. And one of the pieces that we're finding out, for example, in Ukraine is a big electronic warfare environment, very noisy, lots of jamming. We didn't have that in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, nobody was jamming our radars, nobody was jamming our comms, nobody was jamming our GPS. That's going to happen on the modern battlefield. And that's one of the things that we're learning. And a piece of that is how AI helps pick out of the noise what the really important key parts are. What's really an emitting radar and what's just a fake radar that's out there to distract and use up our weapons. you can do a lot with AI. And that's what we're looking at, is incorporating those capabilities into the systems that we have. One of the other big pieces on integrated air and missile defense is being able to tie together multiple different kinds of systems. It's not easy, but it's really important. The first letter, I, is your clue. And in integrated air and missile defense, 1 + 1 + 1 doesn't equal 3. Once you integrate it, it equals 6 or 9. And if you can put AI on top of that, then you get to 18 and 27 and 52. And so I think these are going to be key pieces that need to be incorporated as we move the ball forward on capability requirements.
Minister, would you?
Yeah, I fully agree. Just a little side note on that. The technology for us that can also help us increase the capability while we wait for the new capabilities to arrive, like the big equipment pieces. You know, we can still work with the current ones if we do little upgrades that help us get a better awareness. You know, use the sensors that there are, and you know, bring us quickly to the state of the capabilities that we want to have.
Do we have any questions in the room? Yes, the gentleman over there. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Marcel Gesnet from KNDS Defense Industry, but I'm not asking a question related to defense industry. Are we preparing what-if scenarios? What if Russia deploys nuclear weapons? What if Ukraine is not successful or partially successful? Simple question, complicated answer, I think.
Well, it is a simple question, but one that we've been asking since the beginning of this war of Russian aggression against Ukraine, since the very beginning. Typically, it comes out in terms of vertical and horizontal escalation, one of which is potential use of nuclear weapons. And this came up with, exactly this question came up with the young leaders this morning, interestingly, on the nuclear question. I'll give you kind of the same answer, which is, yes, we are thinking about it. The answer to that is probably best strategic ambiguity. We are thinking about these scenarios. In fact, the Secretary General tasked us at that beginning, and we've worked through between 15 and 20 different solid scenarios on what might happen. One of which was, what if a missile lands on NATO territory? What do we do about that? What do we think about that? How do we handle that? That happened in Poland with an S-300. And I'm glad that we did the exercise to think it through, because the first part of the exercise is, 1, figure out what happened. 2, was it intentional or unintentional? 3, how do you figure that out? Because that changes the dynamics of everything that's going on, and make sure that we have a means of escalation risk management. And one of those means has been the deployment forward of the battle groups, and now their demonstration that they can go from battle group to brigade when and if required. We're still on this journey, but we're making progress.
We have a very interesting question from the audience, which is, considering the difficulties Russia is having in Ukraine, is it not an exaggeration to say they are militarily competitive with present-day NATO? Minister, would you like to start on that question?
To say that they are military competitive, even with present-day, let's put it that Russia's capabilities and their performance were quite a surprise. I have to say that is being diplomatic. Let's say where we see NATO's strength is that NATO represents an alliance that is the biggest there is in the world. And you know, the deterrence comes from the size of and the unity and the common values and everything. But this is something that is very hard to compete with. So in that sense, it is an exaggeration to say that Russia is military competitive with present-day NATO. We are much stronger than what we see currently. Yes, the nuclear situation that has been there for decades, and people have thought about it for a long time, and then there are procedures and scenarios in place, as I say, since decades. On the other scenario, if I may come to that question as well, we see what would happen. I mean, we saw it in, basically we had a situation in 2014, and now we saw, I mean, when Ukraine didn't push back or didn't succeed to push back Russia from Crimea, this is what happened. So the expectation is that this would go on and on, and we don't really want to see that. I mean, that's not in our interest. That is very harmful to our security and defense.
Mr. Goffus, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I agree with the minister entirely, and I would add on top of that, the problems that Russia has right now are primarily land forces. 90% of Russia's land forces are committed to Ukraine, and they've lost 2,000 tanks, but 90% of their air force and well north of 90% of their navy is still intact. They're still a threat. And they still have an advanced missile arsenal. And so this threat still remains for NATO. And it is interesting that with all of those capabilities still there, part of that piece is what we need to prepare for. I think the land forces it would take them a fairly long time to reconstitute and then reorient, even if peace broke out tomorrow. But again, the Air Force, the Navy, the nuclear are all still in place, as is their cyber capabilities.
Do we have any final questions from the room? If not, I will ask one of my own. The expansion of NATO to Finland and potentially also to Sweden soon means that there's more of an overlap between NATO and the EU. Do you foresee a change in the relationship or a closer relationship between the two institutions? Because living in Brussels, I know that they sometimes feel like two parallel bubbles.
Yeah, and you, Lili, you highlight a really good point. And I think this is probably true even within our governments, is that the closer you get to the capital, probably the harder some of those relations are. But I will say that on the ground, NATO and the EU already cooperate extensively. I talked to DSG Ambassador Charles Fries on a regular basis because we have EU and NATO missions on the ground, and I got to say, on the ground they work extremely well together. And I don't see that changing at all. In Baghdad, in Kosovo, in Bosnia, they work alongside each other to complement each other. And the commanders on the ground, the closer you get to that sharp, pointy end of the last 100 meters of delivering foreign and defense policy, the more motivated you are to use the other's strengths and to complement them, and where they have shortfalls, to offer your assistance. And I think that in that respect, the NATO-EU cooperation is already very robust and very much moving forward.
Minister, do you think they will get closer?
I certainly think so. Sweden currently holds the EU presidency. That's already a good start. They take over they take with them with the EU momentum. But Tom is not saying that even in Brussels, in the two bubbles. I mean, we see increased engagement between the organizations as such, but also then the governments are more willing to push the two organizations, the staffs, towards working together in very specific areas which bring concrete results. Military mobility, very strong case in point, but also most recently critical infrastructure, good engagements, good efforts underway in both organizations and together.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists. I think we're all very curious what will happen in Vilnius on the relationship with Ukraine, on defense investment, the relationship with the defense industry. So we'll see in a few weeks. So thank you again, both to the audience and to our panelists. And with that, I'd like to welcome back GlobeSec's Master of Ceremony, Kim Dozier.
Thank you so much. And you all may head out as I wrap up day 2. Thank you, everyone, for sticking through today. It is a little toasty in here in the Danube stage area. So we have had a strong Western Balkan representation, including the Ministers of Foreign Affairs today. We also had a very feisty interview by the Prime Minister of Georgia that I got to watch. If you missed it, it is worth watching on YouTube. And we heard from inspiring opposition voices like Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Svetlana Tishanovskaya, and business experts, etc. We've covered everything from peace in Ukraine and what that might look like someday, prospects for European enlargement. The Georgian Prime Minister talked about making steps towards that, despite the fact that 20% of his territory is occupied by Russian troops. And also about the future of European defense and the lessons that are being learned right now on the Ukrainian battlefield. Also, we talked about freedom fighters and the future of Russia, prescient, or rather very timely, considering the overnight attacks on Moscow that no one has claimed responsibility for at this point. And we also had Armenia and Azerbaijan sharing the same stage and even agreeing on a couple of things. So, housekeeping items. Tonight we've got the GlobeSec 2023 award ceremony. 2 exceptional individuals will be awarded for their significant contributions to freedom and democracy in Central Europe. So for those of you who got the invite, the buses for that leave the hotel lobby at 6:40. And our young leaders will sail the Danube River. They depart at 7:15 p.m. So remember, be back here tomorrow at 9 a.m. for our finale ending with a special surprise. And if you've looked at your agenda, you might have seen what that is. And for that, with that, I say, have a great night. Cheers.